The moment the organ died, the air in the sanctuary felt stolen. One heartbeat it was there. The long swell of the hymn filling the rafters, the little tremor under my feet from the pedals, and the next it was gone like someone had closed a door on the sound. The silence hit like cold water. I gripped the hard wood of the pew so tightly my knuckles ached. My pearl brooch, the one my mother pinned on my coat every Sunday, brushed against my chest and felt, for a second, like the only warm thing left. Richard looked up at me then. I could see the tremor in his hands even from the last row. 30 years on that organ have given him a steadiness most people admire, but his fingers were thin with age. His knuckles knotted like old rope. Tears glinted along the creases by his eyes. When he met my gaze, the whole room turned. Faces, one after another, pivoted toward the back aisle as if drawn by the same thread. I had always been the invisible widow in the last pew. I liked it that way. Until today. It started 3 weeks earlier. I was sitting at James's old oak table. The photograph album spread around me like a tide. There's a smell to those mornings. Lemon oil from the table, the faint tobacco from a shirt he kept in the spare closet, the paper edges of letters softened by years. I found the insurance packet tucked behind some old receipts. James, God rest him, had been saving quietly. $50,000. My hands shook when I read it. For 52 years of marriage we had learned to make room in our lives for the small things. We never expected this. That same morning, Pastor Gregory rose in his sermon and spoke with his measured cadence about the church's past. The First Baptist of Oak Ridge is a place that keeps its history like a hymn book. Our pipe organ has been the voice of this congregation for generations, he said. It's failing. It will cost $45,000 to save her. He laid out the numbers like a man quoting scripture, calm, precise. Richard stood beside him, and you could see the worry in the way he flexed his fingers. He loves that organ the way someone loves a person. I sat through the service with my cardigan folded over my knees, the brooch pinched between my fingers. The decision came like a whisper, not from pride, not for recognition, but because some promises deserve keeping. James used to sit beside me and tap out the rhythm of hymns on his knee. He would have wanted the pipe singing again. I made the call the next day and asked for a private meeting with Pastor Gregory. When I placed the check on his desk, I asked for one thing, anonymity. This isn't about me, Pastor, I said. My voice felt small in the high-ceilinged office. Please, let it be between God and me. He smiled, his practiced, comfortable smile. He nodded and folded the check away. He said the things people say when they mean them sometimes and mean other things at other times. I left with my purse heavier and my heart light. For days after, technicians came and went. The smell in the church shifted from candle wax and old hymnals to the bitter tang of metal polish and the warm oil of workmen's hands. I sat in the back pew and listened to the scraping and the tuning, the tiny confessions of tools. Nobody knew it was my money. That anonymity felt like prayer. Then I overheard them. I was passing the small hallway by the choir room when the door stood ajar. Pastor Gregory's voice floated out, low, brisk. We can't miss this opportunity. Reveal the donor and people will give. We'll have momentum for the education wing. The administrator's answer was hesitant. She asked for privacy. There was a pause. I felt my face burn. A heat crawled up my neck. Gregory exhaled like someone who's practiced impatience. She's an old woman who wants attention in the wrong way, he said quietly, then sharper. We'll announce it Sunday. My hands clenched around the rail until the wood bit into my palms. 4 years he had preached about giving in secret. Matthew, he quoted it often, about the right hand not knowing what the left hand does. I breathed and told myself to keep it quiet, to trust the promise I'd made. But that night, sitting alone in my small kitchen, I pressed my thumb against the pearl brooch until it left a white line on my skin. I thought of James's laugh and of the organ pipes waiting, and for the first time in months, I felt something like fear. Sunday arrived bright with an autumn sun that slanted through the stained glass and painted the aisle in colors. The organ gleamed, polished pipes like a row of silver teeth. Richard took his place and his hands found the keys like old friends. The hymn began and poured into everyone, into the mothers tweaking coats for restless children, into the teenagers trying to look uninterested, into the men who still remembered James's handshake. I smoothed the program in my lap without looking up. Then from the front, Pastor Gregory began to speak over the music. "Today we celebrate, and we want to thank," he said. I felt the pause before he spoke my name. It was a small ordinary thing, a breath meant to be filled. Richard stopped playing. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't slam his hands down. He simply lifted them and removed the weight of sound. The hymn folded up halfway through like a letter not finished. The silence that followed was full of eyes and questions. Then Richard spoke. His voice, usually absorbed by the organ, carried perfectly into the quiet. "Pastor," he said, and I could see him searching for something on the bench beside him. He held up a yellowed envelope. There was a letter. From Eleanor. She asked that it remain between her and God. Heat flushed my face and then gone, leaving a calm I hadn't felt since James died. I stood slowly. The wood of the aisle was cool under my shoes, and the perfume of the lilies at the altar drifted to my nose. "I didn't do it to be seen," I said, and the words surprised me with their steadiness. "I did it because faith isn't a performance. It's a way we love one another." I walked out into the fall light and sat on the church garden bench. Leaves skittered across the path like small brown birds. Minutes later, Richard joined me, his coat smelling of pipe tobacco and the faint perfume of old varnish. We listened together as the organ started again inside. Someone had turned the console back on. The music mended the silence the way a hand across a shoulder mends a trembling grief. He placed his hand over mine, his fingers long and warm despite the cold. "Thank you," he whispered. I touched my brooch and smiled, feeling James's memory like a soft hand on my shoulder. "Some notes," I said, "are more powerful when played in secret." The bell in the tower rang once, low and steady, and I let that sound carry me back inside. The moment the organ died, the air in the sanctuary felt stolen. One heartbeat it was there, the long swell of the hymn filling the rafters, and the next it was gone like someone had closed a door on the sound. My loves, thank you for spending a little of your precious time with me. This channel is still in its first steps, and every new subscription is a breath of life as we work toward our first 1,000. If this story touches you, please click subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I'd love to know who's listening. The morning I found the policy, the house smelled like old paper and lemon oil. Sunlight came in soft through the kitchen curtain, the thin, faded floral one James insisted on when we moved in, and fell in a strip across the oak table, warming the place where we used to sit and drink coffee. I could still see the ring left from his mug. It's the sort of small thing that keeps a person alive in memory. My hands trembled a little as I thumbed through the envelopes, the paper edges rasping like a whisper. I am 68. People in the church call me Mrs. Washington on Sunday and sometimes, when the children crowds by the coffee urn, Eleanor, as if we were the same person. I sit in the last pew, always have. There's a comfort to being at the back, an old habit from the years when James and I wanted to watch the whole congregation together. I know who sits where. I can tell when Mrs. Carter has a new hat. I know which teenagers have started missing and which families bring casseroles in winter. I know the smell of the sanctuary. Beeswax on the hymnals, the thin metallic sting of the brass offering plate, and the dust that gathers in the organ pipes until someone notices. Faith has kept me more than it has led me. I pray out loud in the kitchen most mornings. My Bible sits on the counter near the spice rack. The pages are marked and softened, the thin ribbon frayed. Sometimes, when the church bell out on Oak Ridge, Maine tolls the hour, I stop whatever I'm doing and listen. The bell is a sound that stitches me to the rest of the town. It tells me that the organ has voice in our church. It has bumped and soothed funerals, lifted wedding songs, and carried children's voices through Christmas. Richard has tended it longer than most people have been members. He knows where each pipe hides its heart. When Pastor Gregory mentioned funds in his sermon that morning, his voice like gravel and silk together, I felt my hands go cool. "We need 45,000 to restore her," he said. And the way he said it made it sound like a responsibility handed down. I made the decision in the slow way that old decisions are made. One small thing stacked on another. I thought about James's hands, how they used to pat the hymnals to keep time. I thought about Matthew, about doing charity without fanfare. I thought about Richard, about how he stands at that organ stool and gives everything he has even when his knuckles hurt. Anonymity felt like the only honest way. I didn't want the fuss. I didn't want a parade or a name beside a brass plaque. If this was to be for James, then it must be simple, private, just him and God. The pastor's office smelled of coffee and the faint musk of old books. His chair creaked when I sat. He had that practiced smile on, soft at the edges, the kind men with a pulpit learn to wear. He unfolded the check with careful hands. "You didn't have to," he began. There was something in his tone that could have been gratitude or could have been calculation. I kept my hands folded like a child in church. "Please," I said. "Keep it between God and me. That is all." He hesitated, then nodded and tucked the check into a file. There are small things I notice in the sanctuary that always seem to be true. The velvet curtain behind the pulpit is burgundy, heavy, swallowing light like a promise. A tiny brass cross sits on the altar, bright even when the candles gutter low. The last pew where I sit often holds an empty jacket draped over the rail, a reminder someone was expected and didn't come. These are the quiet props of a life lived among other lives. Walking home that afternoon, the church bell rang 3 times. I felt lighter than I had in months. The brooch my mother pinned on my coat warmed against my chest. Pearls are cool to the touch, but they keep heat from the heart the way memories do. I thought of Richard tuning the pipes, of his fingers finding the keys, of the organ breathing again. The money would do what money does, fix the metal, tighten the leathers, polish the pipes. But what I wanted most was for the music to come back, for the sound to fill the rafters and carry our small town's voice. I did not want anyone to know. Not because I feared thank yous, but because I feared that giving would become a performance. There is a different kind of faith in doing something for the sake of it and leaving its fruit to God. I believed that with everything my years taught me. I believed it when I tucked the check away in Pastor Gregory's drawer, and pressed my hand over my mouth to quiet the small gasp that always surfaces in moments like that. Later, in the solitude of my kitchen as evening settled, I pressed my thumb against the pearl and felt a line of white on my skin. I whispered James's name into the quiet and listened for an answer that never comes in words. Outside, a car passed and the tires hissed on wet leaves. The future sounded like that, small, ordinary noises stitched together. I slept well that night, the house warm and the radio low. It felt like a small, holy secret, and for a while that was enough. I was rounding the corner by the choir room when I heard voices. 2 of them, low and easy, like men used to keeping secrets between coffee breaks. The door was ajar. I could have turned away. I should have. But curiosity is a small, dangerous thing at my age. I paused, hand on the frame, and the corridor smelled of dust and pipe tobacco and the faint lemon polish someone always used on Sunday mornings. Pastor Gregory's voice came first, smooth as ever. "We can't miss this," he said. "Naming the donor will give us momentum for the education wing. People need a face to follow." The administrator answered softer, uncertain. "Mrs. Washington asked for privacy, Pastor." She put it plainly. There was a beat. I felt my heart fall into that pause. The pastor exhaled, the sound precise, practiced. "She's an old woman who wants attention in the wrong way," he said, quieter. and yet every word landed like a stone. "We'll announce it Sunday." My legs went cold. I remember the way my knees buckled a little, and I had to grip the doorframe to steady myself. A rush of heat climbed my neck and settled behind my ears. The pearl at my throat felt suddenly heavy and foreign. I pressed the brooch with 2 fingers until its smooth surface left a pale print on my skin. Hands that had folded hymnals, that had held James's when his fingers trembled in the dark, were shaking. For a moment my breath caught, a tight small knot behind my breastbone. I could feel the funny metallic taste of fear in my mouth, like the tang of the offering plate when you run a thumb along the rim. Everything in me wanted to step forward, to fling open the door and demand what the pastor owed me. A promise kept. I pictured his office that afternoon, how the check had felt cold and decisive in my hand, how I had asked, in a voice I hoped was small enough for only God and him, for secrecy. I could see him nodding, the practiced smile that had opened so many conversations in that room. I had left believing him. Instead I stayed behind the frame. My decision was a small, fierce thing. I could make a scene. I could remind him of Scripture, of Matthew's quiet counsel that giving should be hidden, that the left hand should not know what the right hand does. But confrontation felt like throwing a stone into a sacred pool. I didn't want waves of scandal. I didn't want my name turned into a banner to hang over the new classrooms, my husband's memory paraded on a plaque. So I stood there in the half-light of the hallway, and let my breath grow steady. My palms were cold. A fine sweat gathered at my hairline. The knot loosened not because I forgave but because I chose a different kind of witness. I would not let my giving become the pastor's lever. When the administrator's footsteps faded, I walked away slowly, my shoes whispering on the linoleum. Each step felt like a small exam. Could I prove my faith by silence? Could I keep what I'd given between God and myself even if the man I trusted showed me his other face? At home that night, I made myself sit at James's oak table. The lamp threw a pool of yellow over the papers. I took out a sheet of stationery and wrote, not because I doubted my choice, but so that my intent would be clear if ever anyone questioned it. The words came simply. "This gift is between God and me. Please keep it private." I folded the paper, put it in an envelope, dated it with that day's hand. The motion steadied me. It was a small anchor. Putting the envelope into Pastor Gregory's hands had felt like trusting God with a secret promise. Now I felt the chill of having that trust tested. I thought of James, his quiet ways, how he would tuck money into the heel of an old shoe for the next need, how he would rather feed a neighbor in secret than take a bow in public. I pressed my thumb into the pearl at my throat and listened to my own steady breathing. I decided then not to confront him, not because I lacked courage, because some things are held tight not to be broken open for the sake of being seen. I would let Sunday come. I would keep my place in the last pew. If he betrayed me, then the consequence would be for the congregation to witness and for God to judge what we do with pride. My silence was not surrender. It was a test of faith I chose to take. Still, I could not say I wasn't wounded. The pastor's words had cut deeper than I expected. I slept badly that night, the house full of small noises, the refrigerator's hum, the clock's measured tick. I kept picturing the organ in the sanctuary, its pipes dark and waiting, the idea of music like a prayer between me and James. In the morning I smoothed my hands over my cardigan and felt the envelope beneath my palm, as if it were a second heartbeat. I sat a long time by the window, watching leaves move like little prayers along the curb. Somewhere inside me something had shifted. I had chosen silence. That choice would be the hinge on which the rest of the story turned. The day after, the house felt smaller. The bell in the tower still kept its slow business of telling time, but everything else had shifted. Speech had weight now, and faces in the grocery store turned with a curiosity I hadn't asked for. I made tea and sat by the window, the cup warm between my palms. The pearl brooch lay on the napkin beside me like a tiny argument. There was a soft knock at the door. I knew the knock before I opened it. Polite, practiced. Pastor Gregory stood on my porch and I remember what I asked, I said. My voice did something unusual. It did not tremble. I asked for it to be between God and me. Pastor, I did not want a recognition. He leaned forward, and for a moment his eyes were not the public blue I knew from the pulpit. They were small, almost tired. Eleanor. We thought the congregation needed to see stewardship in action, to inspire giving. We could build the educational wing faster if people had a face to follow. There it was. The reasoning I had heard in the hallway, thinly veiled in the language of need. His hands made a small, dismissive motion. We lose so much if we don't seize momentum. My palm pressed the pearl until it left a pale crescent. You told me Matthew's scripture, I said, about the left hand not knowing what the right does. You preached it often. He blinked. A flicker of something, guilt or calculation, passed across his face. Scripture guides us, Mrs. Washington, but we also have to steward resources. Sometimes the ends justify the means. The room tightened. Those words did not land as an answer so much as an accusation against the quiet I had planned. I held his gaze a long moment. There was no sermon here to smooth it over. Just 2 breaths and the faint tick of the mantel clock. You called me an old woman who wants attention, I said finally, and it was neither a question nor a plea. It was a recording. He flinched then, a small contraction near his mouth. For the first time beneath the practiced smile, his voice hit a sharper note. You meant to speak for the church, I interrupted. You meant to build a campaign. You meant to use a name. My fingers tightened. The pearl dug into my skin, but I did not move it. He exhaled and the breath was smaller. Perhaps I should have spoken differently. I will apologize, Eleanor. To you if you would accept it. The offer was tidy. I could have accepted and let the public face of the matter close like a folded hymn. But apologies can smooth over bruises that still ache. I accepted a private gift, I said. I accepted the responsibility of keeping it private. It was about remembering James, not making a banner. My voice softened, not for him, but for the truth of it in my chest. He looked past me, to the window where the late sun hit the leaves and turned them bright. We tried to do what's best for the church, he said. It sounded less like a confession and more like a verdict. When he left, the air in the room did not follow him entirely. It stayed, heavy with the residue of a conversation that had been both polite and sharp. I closed the door slowly. Outside, a neighbor's child chased a fallen leaf down the sidewalk. Laughter in the small American way that suggests children believe things will always be this ordinary. Later Richard came by. He approached with a slow, deliberate step, hands folded like a man who has taught himself not to make sudden moves. His coat smelled of pipe tobacco and the varnish of the organ bench. He sat at my kitchen table and did not speak for a long while. You stopped the music, I said. The words were simple, almost surprised by their own clarity. He touched the letter in his breast pocket as if feeling the paper through his coat. I found the note when they opened the case, he said. His voice carried that small rasp of someone who has lived with music for decades. I read it. I couldn't let them make you a spectacle. His fingers trembled when he reached for my hand. The skin of his knuckles was map-like, the evidence of years at the keys. I thought if I stopped, we'd have a moment to remember why we play. Not for plaques. For people. Heat rose to my cheeks, not from anger but from something tender and raw. You had courage to stop, I said. He shrugged, a small embarrassed movement. Courage is a generous word. Perhaps stubbornness. Old men are good for that. We sat with our hands touching, small vespers of silence between us. Then he looked up, and his eyes were bright with something like revival. Mrs. Washington, people have been coming by. Some to scold. Some to thank. Mrs. Carter brought lemon squares and refused to leave without telling me your name. It's messy. He smiled, that small smile musicians give when a chord finally resolves. But there's also been a lot of looking. Folks are talking about how we do things. That was the heart of it, how we do things. How the steam of a sermon can be used to lift an offering plate. How a promise can be bent for an imagined greater good. I told Richard about James, about the quiet ways he gave and the way he would slip a warm hand into the pocket of a neighbor's coat. I told him about the note I had left in Pastor Gregory's drawer, and how the act of writing had steadied me. He squeezed my fingers, careful of the arthritis. You did right, he said simply. You did the right thing. Outside, the organ began to swell again. Through the thin walls we could hear the pipes find their breath, and the sound filled the house like a return of family. The music did not erase the stubborn ache of what had happened, but it settled something smaller, practical. The church could still sing, children could still learn the notes, funerals would still be accompanied with dignity. That evening, as the light dipped and the bell in the tower sent a single slow toll out over Oak Ridge, I pinned the brooch back on and felt the pearl press cool against the fabric. Faith, I thought, is sometimes tested not only by storms but by the people who stand in them. I had not lost my faith. I had only learned its shape a little better. It was not a thing to be managed by sermons or fundraising goals. It was a thing to be lived quietly between people and God. After that Sunday, the world felt smaller and louder at the same time. Sound seemed to come in two parts now. The honest noise of life, and under it a low, persistent murmur like a radiator left half on. People who once nodded when I came in would look away before I passed. Conversations tightened into little knots, then unraveled as soon as I drew near. It was as if someone had placed a thin glass between me and everybody else. I noticed it first in the grocery store. Mrs. Carter, who used to stand in the cereal aisle and ask about my garden, crossed to the other end of the aisle when she saw me. Her hands clutched a box of cornflakes as if it were a shield. "Oh, hello, Eleanor," she said, smile quick and brittle. "Busy day." She touched her hat and moved on, the sound of her shoes distancing her in a way that felt deliberate. I walked home with the bag heavier than when I went in. At church, the coffee hour grew quieter. People who had once lingered at the back to chat while the organ rested now left their cups half full. The potluck table still held the same velvet cakes and casseroles, but the circle around it narrowed. Someone would begin a story and then stop when I sat down, as if the air itself had been instructed to skitter away. The children were the worst. They had always been the honest ones, blunt, immediate. One Sunday a little boy I'd seen since he was in a car seat peered at me from the front pew, then whispered to his mother. The mother's face hardened into something apologetic that I couldn't accept or return. The boy's eyes flicked back to mine, wide and curious, and I tried to smile. He hid behind the hymn book as if I were a thunderstorm he could not understand. Letters arrived, 2 or 3 at first. A note from a woman offering thanks. A typed letter from someone wanting to write my name in the history board. A short line from a former Sunday school teacher saying she admired my humility. And then the silence widened. Invites to the bake sale, calls to ask if I could teach the Thursday sewing group. Those dwindled into nothing. My mailbox that used to hold neighborhood news and coupon flyers now held only bills, and an occasional church bulletin with the pictures of smiling faces that no longer seemed to include mine. Doors closed politely, not slammed. There was no theater in any of it, no hot indignation. It was softer. The church ladies who used to stop by with lemon squares left them on the stoop and knocked. Their eyes avoided mine as if the porch was a line not to be crossed. One of the deacons that used to ask my opinion on choir arrangements passed me in the parking lot and nodded without stopping. The nod was the same movement I'd seen 1,000 times, but now it meant something else. I was acknowledged, then put away. Pastor Gregory spoke to me differently, too. His apologies became a script he recited in the foyer after service, hands folding and unfolding like someone rehearsing a confession. Up close, the words felt tidy but thin. "I'm sorry for any distress, Eleanor," he would say. And there was always a half-beat where his eyes searched for some. There were moments of kindness, like small stars in an overcast night. A woman from the choir left a single sprig of rosemary on my step with a note. "For James. Thank you." Richard came by more often, sometimes staying long after the sun went down, bringing newspapers folded in careful thirds and tales of repairs, of pipes that refused to be tuned until a stubborn man coaxed them awake. He listened more than he spoke. Once he stopped the music in the middle of a hymn because he knew my note had asked for no spectacle. He had risked something for me. That kind of loyalty tastes like relief on the tongue. But the isolation kept pressing. Events I'd always been invited to, the sewing circle, the veterans' luncheon, the Wednesday quilting, announced changes. New leaders. Different cheers. No open place set aside. I could feel the social map of town redrawn without my coordinates. Neighbors who used to cross the street to get my advice on chili recipes now waved from the other side and called someone else Mrs. Washington to their children, as if teaching them a new, cautious geography. Nighttimes were hardest. The house felt very much my own then. The lamp over James's oak table, the low tick of the mantel clock, the brood of photographs laid out like a small army guarding memory. My pearl brooch warmed against my chest, a steady thing I could touch when the world felt spaced and sharp. I replayed the morning Richard held the yellowed envelope up at the organ, the way the silence had shifted the power in the room back into a human place. That image was a kind of anchor. I learned to make my own rituals small and whole. I began to water the potted geranium on the back sill at dawn, whispering a small thank you that had nothing to do with congregations or campaigns. I read aloud sometimes, psalms because they were old company, letters from James because they were kind. The whispers in the church and the sideways glances on Main Street stung, yes. But they also clarified something for me. The work I had done was not for applause. It was for music to return and for hands to find the keys again. If that costs me being fashionable in Oak Ridge, then so be it. People will whisper. People will judge. They have always done both. The question that stayed with me through the weeks that followed the organ's reawakening was quiet and personal. Would I let their voices rearrange the life I had quietly chosen? Each morning I answered that in the garden, where leaves rattled like small instruments and the air smelled of wet earth. The organ played on inside the church, and sometimes, when the wind caught just right, I could hear a note drift across the lane and rest on my windowsill. It sounded like grace. The hymn swells. It's the kind of sound that presses into your chest and asks something of you, lungs, memory, the way you stand when everyone else stands. Richard's hands move in the familiar slow choreography. I feel the pedals vibrate through the floorboards like an old heartbeat. The sanctuary smells of lemon polish and beeswax and the lilies on the altar. My fingers curl around the pew rail. The pearl at my throat presses cool against my skin. Pastor Gregory's voice slides in from the pulpit, low and even, layering sermon over song. He is saying something about stewardship, about being examples. His cadence smoother than the organ's swell. There's a pause, a breath that hangs in the air like dust motes. I know it's the moment, the way he always takes a single, careful inhale before a name. I tell myself to breathe slowly. I tell myself to let the hymn carry me. Then the music stops. It isn't sudden like a snapped wire. It dies like someone has gently closed a book. The air feels smaller, as if the rafters have leaned in to listen. My grip tightens until wood bites into my knuckles. The candle on the altar gutters and a little flame collapses, sending a puff of warm, dry soot into the air. For a heartbeat the light goes soft, and the dark edge of the stained glass color sharpens, like someone has sharpened the whole room with a blade. I hear Richard before I see the motion. A tiny intake of breath, a catching sound. Then I see him lift his hands off the keys. His fingers hover for a second, trembling. Tears catch along the creases beside his eyes. They glisten in the dim like small private stars. He looks at me, and in that look is something more than surprise, it is a confession. Pastor Gregory is opening his mouth to say my name. The syllables hang ready on his tongue. You can taste them in the hush. People's heads turn slowly, hair and collars making a slow ripple through the pews, like leaves moving in a line. The air is a held note. Children have stopped fidgeting. Someone's breath shivers out loudly. The whole congregation is leaning forward, and every eye finds mine. My chest wants to flee. My mouth is dry. I fold my hands so that my fingers knot together like rosary beads. I press my thumb into the smooth pearl until the pressure blanches the skin. I count the beats between my heart and my breath. 1, 2, 3. I tell myself, you asked for this to be private. You asked God and you asked a man to keep it between you and the Lord. Then a small sound like paper being unfolded catches everyone's ear. Richard reaches into his coat pocket with that careful musician's slowness. He pulls out an envelope, edges browned, the flap creased from my handwriting. For a second the paper is only his, cradled in his long thin fingers. He raises it, and the envelope makes a naked, fragile statement. Pastor, he says, his voice barely above the hush, but the sanctuary is a place that carries small things. There was a letter from Eleanor. She asked it stay between her and God. Those words land like a bell that hasn't yet learned to stop ringing. A murmur rises then falls like a wave. Some faces fold into question marks. Others bloom into a gentle, stunned admiration. Pastor Gregory's face goes still. The practiced lines around his mouth harden in a way I've never seen. There is a movement at the pulpit. The small wooden cross that leans against the lectern rattles as if nudged by that movement, then tips over and hits the floor with a dull, intimate sound. It's ridiculous, almost a tiny crucifix making the room feel more bare. But the noise feels like a punctuation mark. My palms are damp. I feel the grain of the pew under my fingers. I tell myself to keep my voice small, to keep it honest, to not let the moment become a show for someone else's gain. The congregation is waiting. The world is waiting for the story to be redirected, for the choir of gratitude to rise and for the pastor to smooth it into something useful. I stand. The wood of the aisle is cool under my shoes. The air that meets me smells of old varnish and lilies, and the faint tobacco that clings to Richard's coat. I can hear my heart in my ears, an intimate drum. A door in the side aisle creaks, someone probably shifting in surprise, and the sound fills the silence like a small animal. It's as if the whole room is holding its breath with me. I didn't do this to be seen, I say. The voice that comes out isn't small. It's steadier than I feel. It carries. I hear my own words like a bell too, and they land on the congregation like something both gentle and absolute. I ask that it be between God and me. Faith is not a performance. Pastor Gregory opens his mouth. For a second I think he will smooth it, redirect it, make the moment into sermon again. Instead his jaw tightens. The church waits on his next move like an audience waiting for an actor to choose his line. Richard's hands remain in his lap. Tears soak a small patch of his sleeve. The crucifix lies on the floor between the pulpit and the first pew. A small wooden punctuation where everything shifted. The candle on the altar has gone out completely, and the wick smolders like something unfinished. The silence, that dense, holy, accusing silence, breaks only when a single cough runs through the room, nervous and human. In that suspended space I feel something rearrange inside me. The hush is not only judgment, it is exposure. It is also attention, the kind you cannot buy or beg for. The organ, for the first time in weeks, seems less like an instrument and more like a witness. The notes might come back. The church might forgive. Or it might learn what original intent means. I stand with my hands clasped. My breath comes slow. Outside, the autumn sun throws a bright stripe across the aisle, as if the world is waiting with me. The choice I made is not undone by all these eyes. If anything, the moment sharpens it. A single small act kept between a widow and her promise. The organ died mid-phrase, and for a moment the whole church seemed to thin, like someone had peeled away the sound and left only shape. I gripped the pew until the varnish bit into my palm. The pearl brooch my mother pinned on me every Sunday felt absurdly warm. "Pastor," he said, and his voice carried like a tuning fork. "There was a letter. From Eleanor. She asked it remain between her and God." He raised the envelope. My handwriting. The date. The words I had sealed the night I left the check on his desk. A ripple moved through the pews, a soft intake, then a ripple of soft questions. Pastor Gregory's face, usually a carefully trimmed sermon, tightened. He opened his mouth like a man reaching for a prepared line, and found only the narrowness of a moment he could not shape. I stood. The aisle under my shoes felt cool, the wood grain a familiar map. The scent of lemon polish and lilies rose up, and the light through the stained glass laid colored bands across the hymnals. My heart knocked against the silence. My voice came out steadier than I believed I had the right to speak. "I didn't do this to be seen," I said. "I did it because faith isn't a performance. It's an act of love, private as a prayer." My words dropped into the hush and settled there, clean as coins. Pastor Gregory's mouth tightened. For seconds that felt like minutes he searched for something between apology and justification. Those two halves of him, the shepherd and the fundraiser, pulled at his face. He chose a thin, practiced apology that sounded meant for ears more than for the truth. People shifted. Some faces softened into quiet admiration. Some folded in confusion. A child behind me whispered, "Why did they stop the music, Mama?" And the mother's hand went warm to the child's hair. The crucifix by the pulpit had tipped over in the commotion and lay on the floor like a small punctuation mark. The candle on the altar smoldered, a little wisp of smoke drawing a silver line through the colored light. I walked out. The autumn sun hit my face and felt like an honest thing. It warmed the back of my neck and woke up the memory of James whistling as he worked on the garage radio. On the bench outside, the air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. I sank down and let the quiet catch me. Minutes later, a shadow fell across my lap. Richard sat without ceremony. His coat still smelled of pipe tobacco and the faint varnish of the organ bench. We listened to the sanctuary as if it were a living room across the street. Muffled voices, the shuffle of hymnals, and then the organ tentatively at first, then whole again. Someone had returned to the console. The pipes breathed. He reached across the space between us and laid his hand over mine. His fingers were long and calloused, warm despite the chill. "Thank you," he whispered. The words were small, but they did what they were meant to do. They lifted something that had been heavy in me these past weeks. The gratitude was not for applause. It was for being seen as I had asked to be seen. Simply, honestly. I thought of James, the way he used to tuck a few bills into the heel of an old shoe for someone who needed bread. He had kept his own quiet acts like seeds. They sprout in other people's season. "Some notes," I said, and let the sentence rest, "are more powerful when played in secret." Richard smiled with the musician's stubbornness, like a man proud of a small stubborn chord that finally resolves. The organ inside swelled, and the sound washed over us like water. It was not a miracle. It was the natural consequence of pipes fixed, of hands that loved their work, of a promise kept in the dark. We sat a while longer. People came and went inside, voices rising and falling. Later, some would leave lemon squares on my stoop, some would fumble apologies that felt thin, and others would avoid my gaze altogether. Nothing would right every bruise. The pastor would smooth words into sermons for a season, but the music continued. Children would learn the hymns. Funerals would be accompanied with dignity. The organ would keep the town's long memory vibrating in its pipes. When I pinned the pearl back to my cardigan, it felt steady against my chest. The brooch did not fix everything. It did not erase the strain or the sideways glances. But it reminded me of a quiet covenant. Some things we hold between ourselves and God. Some gifts are meant to breathe in secret, And when they find their voice, to make the world a little more whole. Richard squeezed my hand once, light enough to let me go. The bell in the tower gave a single low ring. I took a breath and let the sound fill me. The music in the church rose again, and I felt, finally, a small necessary peace. The next Sunday after everything, the sanctuary felt both fuller and lonelier. People sat where they'd always sat, but the pews had new edges now, glances that landed and slipped away, whispers like quick prayers. The organ breathed like an animal that had been out in the cold and finally found its hearth. Its notes spilled through the rafters in long, honest lines, and sometimes I let them roll over me and become part of my breath. I stayed in the last pew out of habit. It has a particular view of the church, the backs of people's heads, the ways hands fold around hymnals, the small nervous rituals before a service begins. My pearl brooch lay heavy and familiar at my throat. It had its own quiet temperature, cool against my skin until the bell rang and warmed with the heat of the room. After the service there were conversations as always, plans for the new education wing, offers to bring casseroles, the endless rotation of committees. I listened, nodding when I could, answering when I needed to. Some smiled in a way that reached the eyes. Others smiled as if they were performing their forgiveness for an audience. It is an odd thing to accept the courtesy and measure its shape against the cost. I left before the crowd fully thinned. The church smelled of beeswax, lemon polish, and hymn paper warmed by bodies. The late sun slanted through the stained glass and painted the center aisle in saturated color. I folded the program and tucked it into my bag like a relic. Outside the air was crisp, that brittle sweetness of autumn that smells of apples and dry leaves and wood stoves. My shoes made the small sound on the sidewalk that I had marked for years. As I walked down the steps, I noticed an empty pew in the foyer where someone had placed a single hymn book. It was turned face down, a quiet little pause in the steady motion of people. I thought of the plaque the pastor had imagined, of the ribbon cuttings and the framed photos. For a moment I stood looking at the hymn book and felt how small my expectation had always been. Just pipes that sang again and hands to play them. The bell tolled once as I walked around the side of the building. Richard came out behind me, slow, his steps deliberate. He smelled of pipe tobacco and the faint varnish of wood polish. He did not speak at first. He walked with me to the garden bench where I'd sat the day the organ first went silent. The bench was 2 shades grayer than it had been in June. Leaves skittered across the path like paper boats. We sat. His hand found mine as it had the first afternoon, and there was a steadiness in the contact that felt like prayer without words. We listened to the church for a time, the murmur of people, a child's bright laugh, footsteps on the steps that receded into distance. Then the door to the vestibule clicked shut behind someone, and the sound floated out to us like the end of a sentence. "You did what you said you would," Richard said finally. His voice had that rasp, like wind over piano wire. "You kept it between you and God." I looked down at my hands. The brooch warmed where I'd brushed it with my thumb. "James would have liked the sound," I said. The sentence was simple but true. It folded itself into the space between us and settled. A man crossed the green and walked toward his car. His footsteps were even and fast, the kind of steps people take when they have places to be and want to be there on time. Another couple lingered at the corner, talking low. Their steps drifted away. The cadence of departing feet made a small rhythm. One by one the world resumed its errands, its humble necessities. When the last of the small group left the property and the parking lot thinned, the wind caught at the church door. It moved the latch and gave the door a small, almost polite push. The wooden door closed with a hollow note that echoed across the brick. It was not a dramatic slam. It was a conclusion, soft, inevitable. The sound was like someone laying the last book on a shelf. I rose and smoothed my cardigan. The sun flashed on the pearl one more time, and I felt the little tug of memory, James's hands, the way he would tip his hat at a neighbor, the way he'd never tell you when he'd done something kind. I stood on the path and watched the wind lift a few leaves into a small whirl. They spun and then settled. The stopped movement looked briefly like a small mercy. Richard stayed a beat longer. He watched. I ran my thumb along the pearl and felt the cool edge of it. The brooch had been my small witness, a threaded inheritance from a mother who liked things done quietly. I straightened my coat and walked down the path. The wind nudged at the hem of my skirt, and the air tasted like possibility and something else, the kind of future that arrives not all at once but in small continuous offerings. As I passed under the maple that drops its leaves like pennies, a single note from the organ drifted through an open window, a high clear tone that lingered on the air and then dissolved. It was a thread of sound that said plainly that some things repaired will sing on. I kept my pace slow so I could listen as it faded. The sound stayed with me, pulled back and then released like the memory of a hand on your shoulder. I opened the gate and walked onto Oakridge, Maine. My steps joined the town's slow noise. Cars, distant engines, a dog barking twice and then quiet. The church door behind me was shut. The music inside continued, carrying on amid the routines and the gossip. I walked away with the peace that comes from keeping a promise. My footsteps drifted further down the sidewalk until they were only a soft rhythm among many. The wind closed the church door like a slow breath. The bell in the tower gave a last, low toll, and I let that sound move through me and go. Some doors close. Some open. Some instruments are tuned and returned to their work. And in the last pew in the quiet last row where I'd always sat, an echo hangs, small and steady, like a note held long enough to remember what it wanted to say. The weeks after the organ's first silence felt like living between two beats. Life resumed its ordinary rhythm, errands, casserole plates, Sunday greetings, but there was an undercurrent I could not quite smooth. People adjusted around me the way a seamstress alters a dress. Careful, precise, sometimes awkward. I learned to watch their hands more than their faces. Hands tell more truth than smiles. Inside I changed in smaller ways. I found myself watering the geranium each morning at dawn, the soil giving a faint earthy scent that steadied me. I read James's letters aloud sometimes, not because anyone else listened but because speaking them kept him present in a voice I could touch. The brooch my mother pinned on me felt heavier and more honest with every touch. It was a small thing, cool and oval against my skin, and it kept the memory of my promise warm. Richard became my quiet companion in this. He came more often, bringing stories of stubborn pipes that refused to sing until the right note coaxed them, and he listened to me tell things I hadn't meant to share. His visits smelled like pipe tobacco and wood varnish. When he left, his footsteps receded like a metronome. He never asked for details beyond the name of the hymn I wanted played at James's memorial. He just hummed a bar, adjusted some phrase in his head, and made sure the music would hold what I'd given it to hold. The church, for its part, did what churches do. It breathed and it argued and it forgave in fits. Pastor Gregory threaded his apologies through sermons like stitchwork, neat, public, a little too practiced. Some faces softened when they met mine. Others remained politely distant. Lemon Square still appeared on my stoop, left with hurried notes and downturned eyes. The town's gossip evaporated slowly, as gossip tends to do, until it had purpose only when there was a lull in other news. There were small startling gifts. A child who had hidden behind a hymn book came up to me one afternoon and slid me a paper folded into a tiny star. "For your husband," she said. Her breath smelled of orange juice and recess. The star had been drawn with crayons, and on its back she had written in a careful loop, "Thank you." I held it like a relic. What surprised me most was how unremarkable restoration truly is. The pipes were polished, leather bellows tightened, the swell boxes repaired. No magic, just patient work done by hands that knew their craft. Music returned the day the organ was playable again, tentative at first, then full-bodied, as if the instrument had been sleeping and woke remembering how to breathe. That sound filling the rafters felt like a returned promise. It was practical, ordinary grace. I kept replaying the moment when Richard lifted that yellowed envelope. I watched his face in my mind. The small tremor, the way his eyes softened. I remembered the congregation's collective intake of breath. The way Pastor Gregory's practiced smile tightened into something human. That scene has the quality of a photograph you cannot stop looking at. Simple lines and a light you didn't expect. People asked me later if I regretted not making the gift public. I thought about all the plaques and ribbons the pastor had envisioned and about James, who liked small, unannounced kindnesses. I thought about Matthew and the quiet counsel to hide your giving. Regret felt like a word that belonged to a different person. I had chosen the shape of my witness, and living with the consequences, the sideways glances, the gratitude that smelled of embarrassment, the friendships that thinned, was part of the commitment. Faith, I learned, is sometimes smaller than a sermon. It is the sound of a single pipe coming back to life, the warmth of a hand over yours in a garden, the decision to keep a promise, even when the world asks you to trade it for approval. It is the ordinary, unphotographed moments that stitch a life together. There are things I would not change. I would not trade Richard's quiet courage for the applause Pastor Gregory might have harvested. I would not exchange the sound of that first full hymn for a brass plaque with my name on it. The music has resumed its work in funerals and weddings and the odd Tuesday rehearsal. Children will learn these hymns and carry them forward without ever knowing who paid for the pipes to breathe again. Some people have left. Others came closer. The town rebalanced in the way towns do, small ripples becoming new patterns. I found peace not in their approval but in the steadiness of the choices I had made. James would have liked that. He liked honesty in small things. On quiet evenings I sit at James's oak table, the lamp casting a small circle of light. I press the brooch with my thumb until the metal warms, and I listen for the distant notes of practice through the open window. The sound arrives like a letter slid under a door, brief, deliberate, intimate. A secret kept well becomes its own hymn. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.